Human story, that was the first beauty. Next beauty was the sound of her mother's voice, rippling the waters beneath the drumming skin of her birthing cocoon. Next beauty, her father with kindness in his hands, as he held the newborn against his breathing. Next beauty, the moon through the dark window. It was a rocking horse, a wish. There were many beauties in this age, for everything
Okay,
was
Joy, I don't want to
immensely
interrupt
so
your beautiful
green, greener
music.
than the impossibility of green.
But I see that we're at a critical mass, maybe. So
Grass at dawn.
thank you for pulling that up on such short notice. It was nice.
Okay.
Um, so hello, everyone, and welcome to the final event of this year's really remarkable offering of events in celebration of the Windham-Campbell Prize recipients. My name is Alanna Hickey. I'm an assistant professor of English at Yale. And it's my really great honor to moderate our 30-minute question and answer period with Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. And this is truly meant to be a question and answer session for our audience. In better times, you would be able to speak your questions directly to Joy. So remember to use the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. I see they're already coming in. That's terrific. And I've been instructed to say that if you put text in the chat box or if you use the raise your hand function, unfortunately, I will not be able to see those. So please do use the Q&A box and submit questions or comments at any point in the conversation so that I can read them aloud. Joy Harjo, thank you very much for being here. We were just talking about what a busy season it's been for you. Season being, I guess, years. But thanks for this generous, inspiring, and clear-eyed address. So I wanted to begin our conversation by asking you about the understanding of poetry that you have shared with us in Why I Write or Catching Light in the Dark. And this is, of course, a theory of the poetic that you've been cultivating your entire career, maybe even before you considered yourself to be a poet in the professional sense. But throughout your address today, you describe poetry in a few different provocative and capacious ways. Initially as fulfilling a need for language that goes beyond the ordinary, and then as a tool for navigation into an elsewhere, rungs on a ladder into a different kind of present, and primarily, I think, as a practice for catching light. And so it strikes me that in all of these figurations, you're asking us to begin, as you do in the piece, with place as an important aesthetic foundation for the poetic imagination. I would love to hear anything you'd be willing to tell us about your sense of place, but I guess I'm especially interested in the ways you want to challenge your readers' understanding of place in your writing.
Maybe I'll start with the donut story.
Mm.
Yes, because I came to writing. I wasn't the most likely person to be a poet, for one. I'm not one of these people who is writing constantly from the time they could first speak. I came to it, I was in my 20s. Actually, this year's been 50 years since I started writing poetry, and next year will be 50 years since my first poem was published in the Thunderbird magazine, which was then the University of New Mexico student magazine.
Mhm.
So poetry and I have had quite a journey anyway. And but I think, I don't know all the answers. I'm in an exploration mode constantly. But one thing happened that really kind of shifted or verified what I have thought about place and utterance of language and how language emerges. I mean, certainly it emerges as a need to communicate, whether that's by speaking or singing, or to acknowledge, or to communicate in some way. But there was a period I was living in West Hollywood, and would go to this one gym, and I loved spin classes. And I had just done an hour spin, and I was, these endorphin rush, and suddenly this thought came into my mind of a donut. And I thought, I'm going to go and get a donut. And I thought, but I had the presence of mind, so to speak. And I just stopped and thought, wait a minute. I don't eat donuts. I want to, because I won't go into the story of family, family,
Mhm.
tribal diabetes, all of that. So I've tried to really, um, so I don't eat them. And I thought, wait a minute, where did that thought come from? I don't think we ask that so much,
Mhm.
and you think what a poem is constructed of, the constructive elements, of a poem. It's like, where did that come from?
Mhm.
And I followed the thought. And that's a poetic skill.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
learn to walk through time, you learn to follow an idea, you follow an image, you follow a sound, you follow a meaning, and often those, when you follow them, you wind up in a season, you
Mhm.
wind up in a place, you wind up in a certain place in time.
Mhm.
So I followed that thought, and here was the guy next to me toweling off because he sweat a lot, toweling off, and he was headed over there. Donut shops everywhere in LA, in every corner, and I thought, whoa, that thought didn't belong to me.
Mm.
And I thought, okay, where do these thoughts come from? And if you start following your thoughts, they will wind up at ancestors. They will wind up at place.
Mhm.
I don't think we absolutely understand how much plants have to do, the plants in a place in which we were born and in which we were even raised, how much they have to do with the shape of our consciousness. Now, I could try to get money to do a study to prove it.
Yeah.
I don't think I need to prove it that way, not for myself. But you look behind me at this background, which is it's old Muskogee beadwork from the early in the last century. Those are plant forms, and if you look at all of the formation, like, I guess you would think, at the root of probably mathematical principles, the root of design, architecture, um, even language. I would i would bet on, I don't want to say bet on or posit or any of that, but even
Suggest.
language,
Mhm.
that you would wind up back at plants
Yeah.
and the shape of plants, plant forms, where they come from, how they mean, and how they interact.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's such a beautiful response, and it has me thinking about the concept of form that you provide us in the address. We have an audience question here about dreams, how dreaming and dreams inform your poetry. And I was thinking that in so much of the speech you've just offered us, you're reminding us that any shaping of language is powerful and has material impact on the world around us. It's not just about aesthetic delight. You explained that songs and oratory are used for particular purposes, that they don't circulate aimlessly, that they're deployed to praise, to express grief, for planting and growing, to bring it back to the land. And I hear a kind of careful responsibility in your sense for how and why you shape language into a poem. So I wonder if you can talk about dreams and how they find their way into the shapes of a poem, um, but also about that sense of responsibility, the kinds of pathways that you try to open up when you cultivate delight in sound through your writing.
I guess one thing I was going to say is that I think that sometimes those forms use us
Mm.
to give shape to the world. It could be the form of a piece of land, or an ancestral shape, a cultural shape. And the dreams and dreaming. Now that's a big one, and I've hesitated all my life to speak too much about them. But then when you get to my age, it's like, it's not that you care utterly
Mm.
And so I've been a lot more forthcoming about them because I think that there's different kinds of dreams, different kinds of different kinds of dreams.
Mhm.
There's a diversity. Some of them are just the body, mind, spirit working out fears and fears and hopes and dreams. And some of them are, I ate too much pizza and drank too much beer, and your body's kind of cycling through that to figure out, how to warn you to, and
Yeah, I've
how
had
to
pizza
take care of
dreams.
it. How to take care of it. But some dreams have some dreams are warning dreams. Some actually, give answers to questions you've been pondering. You see that a lot in scientific discovery. Yes, you do the work of it, but the work doesn't just happen in the literal present mind. I mean, there are many kinds of mind and there's many kinds of time. So one of the dreams that I ended Poet Warrior, my memoir, with a dream.
Mhm.
I don't say this is a dream. And one of the worst things you can do as a writer is say, and then it was all a dream. Don't ever do that in a story. It's creative writing
A good
101.
writing trick. Yeah.
But in this dream, it was one of those, and it's real because you're absolutely present in it.
Mhm.
And I was carrying my seventh generation granddaughter into the story. Just as I've seen my grandkids when I've been at their births, somebody always brings them in. Somebody, you don't just, it's a rough journey to get here, and then you're helpless and you're crying out, and you're starting a whole new story, in the story field. And I had this dream, and that's how I ended the book while I was writing Poet Warrior, which was a book a memoir I wrote to pass on um, notes about teachers and teaching in the sense of how we fail, how sometimes we fail. And we have all kinds of teachers, including the ocean, including poets. I name the people, and so on. But in that, I ended the book with that dream, which I felt it was a teaching. They're all teaching. I mean, I think all the poems are teaching poems in a way. Um, and it taught me that I will help carry my seventh generation granddaughter into her story, or I already have, if depending on how time works. And I thought, oh, okay, it was a beautiful dream. I can still see her. And I said, "Whoa, she looks Japanese." And I thought, but she looks like my daughter, Rainey, who people used to think she was Asian, part Asian.
Well, I think I hear in that answer something I identify as a kind of signature of yours that is like a great amount of humility in your approach to writing poetry. And throughout Catching Light in the Dark, you are naming your ancestors as more than what we would think of as conventional influences or something. Authors are often asked about their influences, but you're talking about ancestors as a source of your own voice, as like integral to your self-understanding. And you talk us through your parents, your mother's love of singing, your father's sense of urgency, your Muskogee community, but also people like the blues guitarist Robert Johnson. Like these are all not just influences, but they come to structure your voice and the messages that you're able to carry. And yeah, you call this voice an accumulation of knowledge and being, a sense of work as prayer. And in Poet Warrior, um, poetry speaks to you. There's that beautiful little epigraph you have where you say, to imagine the spirit of poetry is much like imagining the shape and size of knowing. And then poetry says to you, you're coming with me, poor thing. You don't know how to listen. You don't know how to speak. You don't know how to sing, but I'll teach you. Um, I don't know. I guess I'm wondering about that voice, the poetic voice that comes from that sense of accumulation of knowledge. Instead of, we sometimes think of the poetic eye as like, singularly embodied, something deeply individualistic, and that's not your poetic voice at all, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's true. I know I've taught poetry, throughout my life in interval at different moments. And so many of the students are so worried about finding their voice.
Mhm.
When for me, my voice kind of took off without me. I came to see that. I came to see because it's been, I've been learning. I'm still learning along the way, and things shift. Is that there was something larger or deeper than me that needed to speak, even though I was the most unlikely person. I was the shyest kid at Indian school. I don't think I was. I know somebody else was shyer than me. But yeah, and so I was the most, I think I was the most unlikely, maybe not to be a poet generally, because I love poetry and reading and philosophy and thinking about things and so on, and in the way that you can in poetry, a
Mhm.
particular kind of thinking and imagining with words and sound sense.
Mhm.
But the voice, or that, I think everyone, people, I think, because in this culture, you think about how America was founded, and then the kind of, as kind of a land development scenario,
Mhm.
and and the whole manifest destiny, the manifest destiny idea of the singular person, usually male, who goes out and all kinds of opportunity await them,
Mhm.
and including the voice. I mean, we certainly know about all the tropes and ideas around the poet or the writer or the artist as a singular tormented person, you
Mhm.
know, who is tormented because of family, or they think they know too much, or they're visioning, etc. But I think my sense of it, I think, probably comes more from a Muskogean sense of it, in that we, and it's something I've come to see as someone who is a grandmother in her 30s and have watched grandchildren, great grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and other people's children, in this wide community, watching everybody grow up on Facebook, is that you see that no one dies, and you see that everything continues in some way,
Mm.
just like nature in the natural world, like this
Mhm.
tree out here.
Yeah.
It will lose its leaves, things will go under and be quiet, and then here's an emerging again.
Mhm.
And so I would be pretty egoistic if I thought it's all me, and people
Right.
start mistaking that. But and that's where the responsibility comes in. Yes, I like absolute freedom in what I do, and I approach what I do that way. But I also know that I am not emerging from a vacuum, and nor am I going into a vacuum. But we all have gifts that we bring, and we all have certain things, what we're supposed to share.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not so obvious.
Right. Yeah.
That doesn't quite exactly answer what you
No,
were.
it does. No, that's a beautiful response. My thoughts are all over, and I'm trying to clumsily engage with the Q&A. There's a question about representation and giving voice to Indigenous women against the ways they've been popularly portrayed. And you talk about the idea around individualized voice that emerges from the history of our country. And I'm thinking about the I think impressive resolve I experience in your address when you talk about cultural genocide within a meditation about why you write. You name some of the pernicious false narratives around Native nations and peoples that continue a story of cultural genocide. And you recently wrote a remarkable piece in the wake of the landmark McGirt decision. I think that speaks to what you're talking about around continuation, that we don't emerge out of a vacuum. You said there, quote, "The elders, the old ones, always believed that and there will be justice for those who care for and who have not forgotten the original cheated in a relationship with land." And this is still you. I could still hear their voices as we sat on the porch later that evening when it cooled down. Justice is sometimes 7 generations away or even more, and it is inevitable. So I guess I'm wondering, in addition to this important question about giving voice and the representative role you've been asked to play as poet laureate, I'm wondering about how you think of justice, like what justice means to you these days. That's a big, difficult question. If anyone can tackle it, it's you.
I don't know. That is a big question, but I know very early on when I started writing poetry, well, I was painting. I was a student at the University of New Mexico and part of the Kiva Club, which became a center, a Native Student Club became a center for social action for surrounding, and home communities for most of the students. Most of them were Pueblo, Navajo, or Apache. And we sat in on a lot of meetings with coal companies, uranium companies for justice.
Mhm.
And despite eloquent speakers, eloquent, truthful, and ethical speakers from the tribal communities, we saw what happened.
Mhm.
And I remember, I mean, that affected me profoundly. I mean, I knew it. I mean, I know about the story of our people in Oklahoma and how, with the McGirt decision was, you know, reaffirmed that no, we never, we were here as the Muskogee Creek Nation. We never sold that or gave that away. And so that was huge to have that kind of acknowledgement. And last night had to do a little speech for an event, and I realized that Oklahoma was only 44 years old when I was born. And that tells you really how young the country is. I
Yeah.
mean, it's one of the younger states, but at the same time, it's not that old. But when I started with my work, especially when I started writing poetry out of being part of Kiva Club and into this awareness, and suddenly in this community of Native poets and writers, I thought, I remember saying to myself, if I do anything, if my work does any, in my life, I want people to see Natives as human beings. Now, for some people that might sound ridiculous, and others, I think for Native people, know what we mean, because so many of the images in our art were, that we were gone, or we were dead, or we were being romantically mourned as something lost, the lost, and that's just not, and too many people have bought into that, including some of our own people.
Mhm.
And it's important to shift that, because colonization is if you look at if you look at eternity, or the world history, they say it's like this. Colonization, you can't see between my fingers,
Mhm.
is like that in terms of the whole of Muskogee history.
Mhm.
So it's a terrible bump and a great loss. But we are, we just have to recall and continue to create, and renew who we really are.
Mm. Yeah, that's a that's a great response. It reminds me um, of your collection, An American Sunrise, which I want to call your recent collection, but maybe it doesn't seem so recent to you, given how much work you've done, and the deep, long sense of Muskogee tribal history and present as it enjoins an image of an American dawning. Um, it seems you're right. Your insistence that colonization is just this speck. It's not the sum of the story, and it doesn't have to dictate the future we imagine ourselves into. And I think I wanted to ask, as part of all of your work as poet laureate, I've been especially grateful for the editorial labor you've done, which I don't it strikes me as an incredibly generous way to use your post. You've published, and I'll just hold them up, 2 editions of Native Nations verse in your short time as poet laureate, shedding your own light on what I've heard you describe as the ancestral tree of Indigenous poetry in this country. Um, can you say something about why that editorial work is important to you? And I'd also love to hear about any young poets you're especially excited about, or how you're thinking about the future of poetry outside of that tiny speck of the story of colonization.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of there's a lot, it seemed like there's a lot of questions in there, but
Sorry.
yeah, that's okay. One of when the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through as a Norton anthology meant to be a comprehensive, if anything can be comprehensive, from, time immemorial to present for, how many tribal nations do we have? Over 500 tribal nations, federally recognized. There's some state tribes that are legit, many aren't. I mean, how do you encompass that? We were given 300 pages at first,
No,
and then
no.
wound up with 400. And even then, that is not, even if you were to put one poem from each tribal nation, that would not be enough space.
Mhm.
And then through time. So it was quite a task. And I'm not the only editor. I you know, directed the project all the way through, but all of the editors, I'm happy to say, were not outside experts, but they were inside experts, native poets themselves. So that one was well into the works before the poet laureateship, but
Mhm.
it was timing. It was great timing because the poet laureateship was announced and American Sunrise was already scheduled to come out, and it fit. It's interesting
Mhm.
how it fit. And then this book, and then for my project, I thought it was important. I mean, the position has opened the door for Native people and for Native poets. So Living Nations, Living Words came out of the Poet Laureate Project, which is a mapping, a
Mhm.
contemporary mapping of some Native poets. I wanted to do all of them, everyone we could find, but there's we don't have the staffing. The staff takes a lot of staff to do
Yeah.
that. So, but it was a start, and that book came out of the poems. And the poets talk about place. So now there is a collection in the Library of Congress Folklife Center of Native poets,
Mm,
contemporary Native poets speaking, reading their poems and speaking about place.
that's
So
wonderful.
those are two of the projects that have the editing projects. I say I won't do another, and then I have these ideas, but it's, I think all of us, we're all given gifts, and part of that is then at some point to share.
Yeah.
There's so many young, you have to read so many wonderful native poets. I mean, I think there always has been, but of course, it's like trees. You notice trees, we all have our seasons, and there's some years you get a lot of walnuts and some not so much, and so on. And we're in a season, a very ripe season right now for native poetry and
Mhm.
native literature. I mean, just this last year, the Pulitzer Prize, Natalie Diaz and
Mhm.
Louise Erdrich. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah.
But there are so many who write in ways that, enliven their communities, or their work is a little more outside and maybe more even, a little bit more embedded in certain ways. So,
Mhm.
but, but anyway, it's been great to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a new anthology, I think. What is it called? It's the Dene.
Oh,
It's
the Danae Reader.
Yeah,
I
the
have it
Dene
here
Reader.
somewhere. Yeah.
I grew up with, I grew up with those, like Lucy
Mhm.
Tapahanso and Rex Jim and all those. We all have been associated from way, way back.
Mhm.
So I was
Yeah,
happy
and
to see that. Yeah.
yeah, it's exciting to see tribal nations determining their own literary genealogy in that way too. I think the anthology form has, yeah, been really accommodating to these projects. And
Yeah.
um,
I was going to
we're-
say that you can think of an anthology sort of like a performance, a circle. So,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
we're about at time, but maybe I'll let the audience take the final question. And this is a question about your writing practice. Someone seeking advice about how to write how to bring words back on the pages. I was thinking of the last words of your lecture, start anywhere to catch the light. What place has that anywhere been in your life? And what would you suggest to a person trying to find it? Thank you for the wonderful session.
Place and writing practice.
Mm.
I'm not the best person to ask. Well, I get a lot done,
Yes, you
but
sure do.
I do get a lot done. And I think because I started writing as a single mother with two children, going to school full time, working, and so I learned to write through anything.
Mhm.
And sometimes it doesn't take, you just take it as you can. but some people need elaborate, and they have the elaborate writing rituals. Everyone is different, but you need to find that for yourself. For me, I get into these modes, and I'll write, like I wrote my talk and the resultant book on airplanes, um, airplanes, and in moments in between having to go into a studio and perform a song for a documentary. I wrote wherever I could. But in the best of times, what I like doing is getting up before I start thinking. And ultimately, I mean, that's what writing in a journal does for me. I can just write, and then I get into that zone. I don't know, I don't even like that word, get into the zone, because but I get into that place where the imagination opens, and that's sound. It's like when I was writing Poet Warrior, and I'm writing along, and then the phrase comes up, even the monster has a story. And I had to stop and say, thank you, where did that come from? It followed, but it was an insight that I didn't sit and just think, well, I'm going to write toward that insight. That's not what happened. As you get yourself into that place where the insights and the language and the play and all of that can really start happening, because if you bear down on it with your literal mind, your literal mind, I don't think, is necessarily geared toward creativity. It's basically toward living in the linear world and moving through it precisely in a certain kind of manner. But when you're writing, and with even scientific, just any of that, you have to kind of go past that to a place that opens up to all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I so appreciate that about your understanding of what poetry is. It's process. It's coming into understanding. Yeah, it's not literal minded, before the page. It happens in
Even
the
though
act.
yes, even though the literal is an important part of it, you come in with, and revise. I had a 5-minute speech, which was difficult to do, but I did. I don't have the page right here. And I revised it and revised it before I went. And I sat there and revised. I cut out half of it. And then, because I realized it didn't fit with the audience or what was going on, and I totally revamped it when I got up when I got up to the stage.
On stage? Oh my God.
Yes, that part was a little, I remember I had people going in a rhythm and step, because there's a rhythm. And then I hit to this one part. It was kind of a little uneasy transition. And then I found, but that's the other part of it. You have to get to that place where your voice can speak. You have to get there. But then after that is I like the revision part, where you read it and think, okay, this doesn't work. And what's going to work in it? The rhythm is off here, and even then you can move into a place where cool things happen.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll leave it at that. We're a little over the half-hour mark. But I wanted to thank you, Joy Harjo, on behalf of Yale and the Windham-Campbell Prizes. Thank you so much for the powerful address and for this really lovely conversation. And before we go, I'd like to remind our audience that the book version of the address you've just heard will be published by Yale University Press in 2022. But until then, you can view the video on the Windham-Campbell YouTube channel, along with the rest of the festival content. Thanks to our audience for their brilliant questions, and thank you again, Joy. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Yeah.